Welcome to Firearms Friday, coming to you from the Wyoming State Museum here in Cheyenne, Wyoming. I'm Evan Green. I'm the firearms historian for the museum. So today we have a little rolling block carbine with a really fascinating connection to Wyoming history. This is a .45 caliber carbine, but it's not a .45-70 because it will not take a .45-70 cartridge. So it is some proprietary cartridge, apparently, that is shorter than the .45-70, and I wasn't able to track down what it was. But this is a really nice little carbine, and when I first picked it up, I thought, oh, that's a Remington rolling block. No, it's a Whitney carbine, and Whitney was a firearms manufacturer in the 18th century, and in fact is in some sources credited with developing or perfecting interchangeable parts for firearms, which greatly simplified the manufacture of firearms. This is a really nice little carbine. It's in excellent shape. It's probably got 95% of the original blue finish on the barrel. The hammer and action receiver is nicely case hardened. The walnut stock is in really good condition, although I don't understand what these two screws here are for. Some of the firearms that have been on display here and other places have had labels, plaques, metal plaques attached. So I don't know if that's what those screws are or not, or why they're there. I didn't take them out. This is a saddle ring carbine. It's got that neat saddle ring on the off side of the receiver. So really, really nice carbine. Really very good condition. So what's the backstory? Well, in 1873, two brothers from New York City came to Wyoming to cash in on the livestock industry in this area. This was a boom time for the cattle industry because they were promising and achieving incredible profits, because all you had to do was bring up a bunch of longhorns from Texas or purchase a herd of cattle, turn them out on free grass and free water, and let them do what they do to propagate their offspring, and then sell off the calves at some point. They were making 10, 20, 30% profit per year. It led to an overstocking of the range. It's a story we'll get into here in a minute. But again, Cheyenne was kind of the center of that, at least for this area. So the two brothers were William and Thomas Sturgis. And it was William Sturgis who donated this carbine to the museum. And again, they came to participate in the cattle industry, but got involved in lots of other things. They were involved in the founding of the Wyoming Stock Growers Association. And while there is no record that they participated in the Johnson County invasion in 1892, they were certainly aware that that was going to happen, and if not directly supported it, at least didn't oppose it, according to the records that we have. They were also assisted in establishing the Cheyenne Electric Company. It's interesting that Cheyenne was one of the first cities in the United States to have electric streetlights. So they were involved in that. They were involved with mining industries. William was, at one point, I think, the chief officer for the Wyoming Stock Growers Bank. So they were really involved in early days in Cheyenne, Wyoming, and Laramie County. And while I was doing some research about this carbine and about the Sturgises, I ran across this letter, which I find really interesting. This is addressed to dated March 1, 1936. Addressed to Hans Gotchi, chairman of the Lusk Lions Club in Lusk, Wyoming. Dear Sir, I have your letter of February 26 and take first opportunity to reply. I am very interested in everything relating to our old cattle days, and your date of the early 80s seems very modern to me. My brother and our partner Goodell turned our cattle loose in the spring of 1873 when we had all of Goshen Hole for our home range. And Goshen Hole is an area located kind of northeast of Cheyenne, between here and the North Platte River is the Goshen Hole. Where Lusk now is was then the land of the Sioux and Cheyenne Indians, who were pretty mean neighbors. Our scalps were not as safe as our cattle, although we managed to save them. When the Indians were removed from the North Platte country, we followed them up to the Cheyenne River. Again, further north of the North Platte River is the Cheyenne River. The present S&C station on the Burlington is one of our Sturgis and Goodell ranches. Sturgis and Lane was a contemporary firm made from our old sheep ranch, so they were not only involved with cattle, they were involved with sheep. I was surprised in the source of doing some other research that in 1910 there were almost 1 million cattle in Wyoming, but over 6 million sheep. That surprised me. Francis E. Warren, who was one of the first senators of the state of Wyoming and involved in territorial legislature as well, had 80,000 sheep in Laramie County when he was also involved in the cattle business. Anyway, Sturgis and Lane was a contemporary firm made from our old sheep ranch, and the two firms were merged into the Union Cattle Company. The brand you asked about, OS, was one of our brands, I think, but was not one of the main brands, but came to us with some purchased cattle. Our original brand was an S on one hip and a G on the other, and that of the Union Cattle Company was O-bar-O on the left flank and known as the bridle bit because it, in cross-section, would resemble a horse bridle. Dear old bridle bit was well known, formed in 1883 with $3 million of capital. $3 million in 1883, inflated to 2020, is almost $80 million. So these guys were into it for money. In 1886, we branded 14,000 calves, which gave us 70,000 cattle, with ranches from Norwood on the northwest stretching down into Nebraska. And the Norwood River is, again, northwest Wyoming. So they were dealing with a huge area and lots of cattle. Our estimate of 5 times the calf crop as the number of herd in our brand. And they didn't count these cattle. They were only making estimates. And because some of the people involved in the livestock industry were absentee landlords, sometimes the guys on the ground weren't reporting that accurately. They were making wild guesses and covering, in some cases, their misappropriation of the owner's cattle. Anyway, our estimate of 5 times the calf crop as the number of herd in our brand was proved when in 1889 we branded 5,800. And notice that's about a third of what they branded in 1886, and tallied 29,000 after losing over 40,000 head of cattle in the disastrous season of 1886-87. And 1886-87 was an incredibly long and severe winter on the high plains across the Rocky Mountain West. And their losses were not unusual. Some outfits lost 90% of their livestock. And the plains, when the thaw finally came in the spring, the plains were littered with cattle corpses. Rivers were choked with cattle corpses. And that really changed for some ranchers, for some livestock producers. It really changed their attitude. I found a quote from one of the ranchers who went through that disastrous winter saying, "I will never own another herd of cattle that I can't feed during the winter." So it changed that process of, geez, just turn them loose and we'll round them up in the spring and sell the calves. They changed that to fenced pastures and to growing hay and feeding the cattle through the winter. Anyway, the letter continues. For our first years, our losses were nothing, for out of 531 Texas steers turned out in 1873, I sold and received the cash for 526. So they lost 5 head over that winter. And that's after 2 years. This was after they had been turned out on free range for 2 years. They only lost 5 head. So, letter goes on. My brother and I ran the Wyoming Stock Growers Association for many years, and for several years I was the editor of the Wyoming brand book. I knew nearly all the brands in Wyoming, and I left in the Stock Growers Association office a full set of the books from which you can get much brand information. I fancy I am almost the only one left of the old timers. I am past 93 years, and may, some days, if my eyes recover their usefulness, write up some of the old memories, and I have already made a commencement. So, very truly yours, William Sturgis. So, I think that's a real synopsis of what happened in Wyoming and across the Rocky Mountain West during that terrible winter of 1886-87. So, Whitneyville Carbine, he unfortunately doesn't say, and there's nothing in the records, that if he actually carried this, it doesn't show much signs of use, but you have to assume if he had mean neighbors of Sioux and Cheyenne, that when they went out into the field, they were probably armed to protect themselves. So, Whitney Carbine. Looks like a Remington. It's not. It's a rolling block carbine. So, if you got questions or comments, record them below, or you can call the museum. I'm not here every day, but they'll take a message, and if you want to talk guns or Wyoming history, I will return your call. So, thank you for watching.